Welcome back. We're talking with James DeMeo, an expert on keeping your family safe in emergencies. What tips can we share with our viewers, James? Let's start there. Well, before we get into the tips, let's talk about the threats themselves. What does the average family face in the way of threats today, here in 2018 and beyond?
Oh, absolutely, it's a terrific question, and the threats seem to be kind of an A through Z laundry list. Active shooter, workplace violence, bomb scares, inclement weather. We had Florence a couple of weeks ago. The citizens in Florida, as we speak, are dealing with Hurricane Michael. So we have that threat of severe and inclement weather. Certainly, IEDs and vehicles being used as potential weapons. Again, as I mentioned earlier, active shooter, some type of disenfranchised person, maybe a workplace violence scenario. So it's a laundry list. And again, when we look at the book, we talk about the 8 different chapters. You could be at your local YMCA working out on a treadmill, and all of a sudden there could be a disgruntled employee who was just terminated, and you're in that space. How do you react to that situation if you're confronted with someone who becomes violent right in front of you? So we look at it from kind of a multiple view angle, Bill. It's not really having tunnel vision, but it's creating that plan, having that awareness, putting the fear factor aside because we're prepared. We've discussed this plan with our family based on, again, the venue or the event we're attending on that particular evening, as an example.
Well, just by definition, the unexpected is just that. You're not expecting it to happen to you, and it becomes very surreal. And because of that, people panic. I mean, I do. I'm sure I would. And fear kind of takes hold of you, in which case, if you don't have a plan, your emotions or that fight or flee kind of instinct that you have takes over. You mentioned workplace violence. What would you do if you were, in fact, confronted by somebody who is violent? Let's start there. What would you recommend a person do? You're in the workplace, you have somebody who's terminated, maybe he's got a gun, maybe he doesn't, but he's violent. What in the world do I do?
Again, another terrific question, but I always talk about early attack indicators. So if you're sitting next to somebody at work and they're having a bad day, you're really obligated to let your immediate supervisor or human resources know that maybe somebody is in fact having a bad day. So it's looking for those signs, those behavioral clues up front. Again, kind of a situational awareness to your own personal safety, and then sharing that information with somebody in your workspace. Don't presume it's somebody else's responsibility. Take responsibility for your safety within the workplace. And again, I always talk about stakeholders coming together, having meetings, discussing how they would, plan for a certain, bomb scare or some type of an errant drone, as an example, that could disperse some type of chemical or radiological agent, here in Raleigh or outside PNC Arena or what have you. But we look at things from multiple views and we plan in advance, especially in the workplace. We place ourselves in the best position possible to best, obviously deal with that type of situation.
So you're talking prevention in this case is to trying to keep an eye and communicate that. Now you're in law enforcement. Do you go with your gut? Is it really important if you feel that something's a little off? Is that worth getting up and making it known?
Well, as we mentioned during the break, one of the things that I learned in law enforcement in 21 years is everything is the real thing until proven otherwise. So we can't just assume that it's fireworks, or we can't assume it's just, the speakers. It very well may in fact be gunshots. And we have to prepare for that kind of scenario in advance. So, I always talk about just looking at things and sharing information. And you mentioned earlier, communication is key. Looking for those clues, and again, in the workspace, sharing that information. And working, many of the security officers that work in security in corporate settings are retired law enforcement. They're ex-military. Share that information with them. Be a conduit for you and your fellow coworkers. Become part of the safety team. Volunteer to, take a leadership role in the event you're faced with an adverse situation.
Now, this is something I'm curious how you'd respond to this. And we've had big crowds, right? We've had Las Vegas and others in which you're part of a crowd, and now you hear the bang, 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 and all of a sudden it becomes apparent there is a nut, and he's shooting into the crowd, and you could be next. What kind of plan could you possibly have to prepare for something like that?
Well, again, a terrific question, and we saw certainly Mandalay Bay and these densely populated areas. I think professional sports does a great job hardening those targets. When you go to the stadium, you go through a metal detector or
Yes.
metal screening or whatnot.
Is that enough, do you think?
I think it's
Going to weed out the vast majority?
it's going to make the bad actor, if you will, think twice about
right.
trying to, breach that space. But that's not to say someone won't wait outside the stadium like we saw in Manchester. When people are exiting after 2 or 3 hours, we talked about earlier, if people are drinking alcohol for a couple hours, they may be affected differently than someone who's sober. And now you're leaving a space which is a potential choke point or a bottleneck, and someone decides to, again, use an IED or an active shooter situation, and now, let's say you've been drinking, you may not react the way you would have if you were not drinking, as an example. So we talk about those spaces we want to be aware of, how we got in, how to get out. Where did we park our car at the stadium? If we took mass transit, are we going down into the subway? We want to be mindful of those densely populated areas that flow into transportation hubs, as we saw with Mandalay Bay. We had a confined space, but ultimately it was part of an entertainment zone. And who would have thought an aerial attack would have ever taken place? 32 floors up into a confined space. Now you're in that space, what do you do?
Right,
Well,
what do you do?
Well, lessons learned, certainly you want to, run, hide, fight, but, obviously you want to know in advance that you're going to know where the exits are. You're going to be aware of how to get out of that space in a timely manner. I think it's, as you mentioned earlier, it's the fear factor. It's the pandemonium, the chaos.
They're moving.
Exactly.
How do you prepare, how do you protect yourself, not only from the shooter, but from being trampled? We've seen that, where people are killed just because of this herd mentality, everybody trying to get out.
Exactly. It's a great question. It goes back to the people that scan your tickets. They need to be trained on how to lead people safety during times of crisis. But it's also incumbent upon the patrons and the fans to look at the codes of conduct before they go out to a venue, to know exactly what they can bring to a Panthers football game, as an example, or Fuquay Arena, a high school football game. What's allowed, what's not allowed. But educate yourself, because an educated fan is a safe fan. So I always talk about just having that awareness, that education, having that discussion, no matter where you are. We mentioned earlier, it could be your place of worship, it could be at the ballpark, it could be in a shopping center, you could be at the YMCA, but you've had that conversation, you're aware of your surroundings, you're looking for somebody who may look out of the ordinary to you, and you're sharing that information with somebody in a position of authority in a timely manner.
This is good stuff, don't you think? Don't go away, because we'll be right back. Just a couple of minutes. It's worth it.